Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 45 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and little tips and goodies that you can use and that will hopefully keep you alive. Now, today we're going to talk about night flying and the many things that your CFI probably didn't teach you about flying at night. Plus, Christmas is only days away, and if you're thinking you'd like to treat yourself to some great pilot gear, we've got a new site that we can send you to where you can do some comparison shopping. Plus, coming up in the news, we're going to talk about yet another pilot that's facing jail time, and we'll tell you how he got in trouble. Plus, Garmin has a new portable ADS-B receiver, and we'll tell you some interesting features it has that aren't available in other receivers. And finally, there's a proposal to hold the world's first flying car race, and we'll tell you where that race is going to be held. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot. And hey, let's have some fun along the way. I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and I fly, about 5 to 6 days a week. I'm always learning new things, and I like to share them with you. I'm also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft, and I just learned today that there are some big incentives that they're offering for orders placed by the end of the year. So if you're thinking of buying one early next year, call me. We'll help you out with some big savings this year. And I'm the author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. Now, last week in episode 44, I talked about my epic trip flying a Cirrus SR20 from San Jose, California to Miami with a new owner. So if you didn't hear it, check out that episode. Oh, and here's a little tip. Make sure you listen to the very end of that episode and this one so you can hear the bloopers. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, the pilot of a Ryan Navion has been indicted by a federal jury in Alaska in relation to the crash of that airplane, which killed one person, injured the pilot, and injured two others in 2014. The pilot, Forrest Kirst, age 60, has been charged with piloting an aircraft without a valid airman certificate and for 2 counts of obstructing an NTSB investigation. If convicted, he faces up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. According to the NTSB report, the pilot initially reported to first responders that he had encountered a severe downdraft while approaching the high mountain pass, which caused the airplane to lose altitude. But the NTSB concluded that was pretty unlikely given the weather at the time. 2 weeks after the accident, the pilot blamed loss of control on a front seat passenger collapsing onto the controls as a result of motion sickness drugs. The backseat passengers were allegedly unresponsive at the time. But none of the 3 passengers recall this, and the front seat passenger was found with his seatbelt and shoulder harness on when first responders arrived on the scene. Well, 2 months later, yet another story. The pilot wrote to investigators to say that a propeller blade had separated in flight, which was contrary to his post-accident interview. After exhaustive analysis, the NTSB concluded that blade probably broke during impact with terrain. Furthermore, the U.S. Attorney alleges that Kirst has been seen flying since his license was revoked following the accident, which is yet another federal charge. The NTSB report made the news when it was first published by citing lack of FAA oversight as a factor in the accident, given Kirst's prior record of accidents, incidents, and check ride failures. And from aeronews.net, the Government Accountability Office has determined that the U.S. Department of Transportation violated an anti-lobbying provision when it retweeted and liked a tweet urging followers to tell Congress to pass pending legislation. That was, of course, about ATC privatization. The Smarter Skies Twitter account was retweeted. Of course, that's a group that's been supporting privatization. The tweet stated, "We need to modernize air traffic control. Current system is 70 years old. Tell Congress to pass the 21st Century Aviation Innovation Reform and Reauthorization Act." Well, the GAA concluded that the DOT violated the rules when they both liked and retweeted that tweet, urging the public to contact Congress in support of pending legislation. And here's a quick note. If you're going to be flying in South Florida over the holidays, the FAA has issued an advisory to inform pilots of a temporary flight restriction, a TFR, that's going to be in effect from December 22nd all the way to January 1st in the vicinity of West Palm Beach, Florida, where the president will be for the holidays. By the way, I recently read that on one recent weekend, there was not a single violation of that presidential TFR in Florida, and that was the first time that that's been the case all year long. So, hey, let's be careful out there and avoid all those TFRs all the time. And from generalaviationnews.com, there's a new online Mayo Clinic BasicMed course, and that's a free program for pilots who are looking to qualify for a medical through the FAA BasicMed program. They say, quote, "This course has been a culmination of efforts of many colleagues at Mayo dedicated to aviation safety, a wide range of medical experts across the organization, as well as with input from experts with civil aviation medical associations across the country, have contributed medical knowledge to help pilots recognize medical risk in an effort to keep them and the passengers who they fly safe." Now, the online medical course is just one part of the required steps that pilots have to go through to qualify under the new BasicMed program. A pilot must first obtain a physical examination from a state licensed physician, who could be your regular doctor, and that person must attest that the pilot is physically and mentally fit to fly. Now, the course is separated into 6 modules, including conducting medical self-assessments, warning signs of serious medical conditions, mitigating medical risk, awareness of prescription and over-the-counter drugs, the importance of regular medical examinations, and details regarding requirements on pilots if a medical deficiency exists. They say the course takes about 90 minutes to complete, and is followed then, of course, by an online examination where you will be tested on your knowledge. It's accessible at basicmed.mayo.edu. The link is also on the FAA's Basic website, and we'll include it here in our show notes. And also from General Aviation News comes this story that there is an all-in-one portable ADS-B and SiriusXM receiver now available from Garmin. According to Garmin, the GDL 52 is the first portable receiver that's capable of receiving both ADS-B weather as well as SiriusXM aviation weather and audio, that's the SiriusXM radio, for display and control on select portable and mobile devices, think tablets and phones. It includes a built-in battery and provides GPS position data as well as backup attitude information, which you can use for synthetic vision depending on what apps you're using. In addition to the weather data, the pilot can use the GDL 52 to receive ADS-B traffic, and it's a dual-band receiver, as well as audible alerts to identify potential traffic conflicts. Now, they say exclusive to this product are their patented target trend and terminal traffic, which basically helps pilots understand the target trajectories and the closure rates of different aircraft. So think of not just a vector for the aircraft that you're looking at, but also for your aircraft, and therefore being able to figure out if you're going to have some kind of convergence. And if you're wondering why you might want to have both weather services from ADS-B and from XM, consider this. The XM satellite system is often available on the ground before a pilot takes off, so you could use it at home or on the runway, whereas ADS-B is only guaranteed at certain altitudes and is often not available at the surface at many airports. Also, there's some differences in the weather that's provided. So, for example, only ADS-B includes NOTAMs, but a number of the weather services for ADS-B are limited in terms of the distance from which you can get them. So, for example, if you look at TFRs, you can only see them 100 miles out, whereas on SiriusXM, you can see TFRs simultaneously for the entire country. And that's true for about a half a dozen different weather services. And coincidentally, last week I received an email from a marketing manager at Garmin who said that he listens to this podcast and wondered if I'd be interested in evaluating one of the GDL 52s, and I now have it sitting here on my desk. So we'll be talking about it more in the future when I get a chance to try it out. List price on it, $1,149. If you want to compare this with some of the other units that were evaluated by our listeners doing our ADS-B receiver listener survey, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click in the upper left-hand corner on ADS-B receivers. You can see the comparison, and you can order directly there from Amazon by clicking on the links. And if you do, we'll make a couple of dollars on each of your purchases, and that helps support the show. By the way, go ahead and check out the headsets page, which you'll also see in the upper left-hand corner of our page. We'll include links in our show notes, of course. Just tap on your smartphone on the artwork, and you'll find a link to it. And in international news, this comes from Flyer magazine, flyer.co.uk. The new Rotax 915 ISC3 engine has been type certified by EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, with a maximum power output of 140 horsepower, which is 5 horsepower more than originally targeted. The team is going to now concentrate on getting FAA approval. The increased power of 104 kilowatts is available up to 15,000 feet. It's intended for use in fixed-wing, gyrocopter, and other applications. So far, there are 12 aircraft manufacturers who have integrated the engine and will make the aircraft available soon, plus an additional 47 aircraft manufacturers are in the final stages of integration of this engine. A couple quick facts on the Rotax 915 ISC. It's a four-cylinder, four-stroke liquid air-cooled engine with opposed cylinders. TBO time, 2,000 hours, and service ceiling of 23,000 feet. And from General Aviation News comes a story of a fatal accident, which I think serves as a cautionary tale to all of his pilots. They say that an ATP pilot who was a U.S. Navy flight instructor and newly certificated CFI for the civilian world was flying his cousin to his home base in his RV-4, that's a Vans RV-4, where he planned to provide her with initial flight training. He received a weather briefing earlier in the day, and the briefer indicated that VFR flight was not recommended due to instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC, at the surface. Despite the briefer's statement, the pilot indicated he planned on remaining VFR throughout the flight. Before takeoff during ground operations, the pilot discussed the weather with a former flight service station pilot weather briefer who told the pilot the weather was really bad in the direction of his destination, and the pilot agreed, yet he chose to depart anyway. He reported that the pilot appeared to be in a hurry. No evidence was found indicating the pilot received any additional weather briefing information before takeoff. His flight departed to the northwest toward an approaching cold front. The conditions associated with the front included low clouds and mist. As the pilot headed toward the destination, the flight encountered the front, and he declared an emergency with air traffic control, stating that he was in IFR conditions and that his airplane was not capable of IFR. Radar data of the final segment of the flight showed the airplane in a left 180-degree turn for 43 seconds, immediately followed by a right 90-degree turn for 37 seconds before radar and radio contact was lost. The last return was observed at an altitude of about 1,200 feet mean sea level. The wreckage was located near Greenville, Florida, about 0.2 nautical miles from the last radar return. Both the pilot and his cousin were killed in the crash. And ladies and gentlemen, I think the thing to take away from this is even if you have an ATP certificate or a military instructor pilot, you still cannot survive an encounter with IFR conditions in a non-IFR capable aircraft. And I know when we're young, it's sometimes fun to think that we're Superman, but we're not. And finally, from aeronews.net comes this story that an Australian company wants to host the world's first flying car race. They say, what might you get if you crossed a Formula One race car with a racing quadcopter? Apparently, they say, an Aluda Airspeeder Mark I, which this Australian company hopes to have racing next summer. They say the concept has been under development in secrecy for 2 years, and now it's ready for crowdfunding, and a presence has been established on Kickstarter to get the race off the ground. According to Kickstarter, the Aluda MK1 is the first iteration of Airspeeder made by Aluda. It's a simple, lightweight design, and it was built with cost and performance as the primary concerns. The company and its staff all have substantial experience with drones and drone racing and know how easy it is to make small mistakes and big crashes. With this in mind, Aluda set out to build a test frame that was affordable and easy to manufacture. This will allow them to push the control systems to their limits without fear of crashing a very expensive aerial frame. They say a 1-to-3 scale mile has been flown and a full-size prototype is taking shape. To be able to carry a full-size human, the Airspeeder is powered by a set of 500 kilowatt electric motors and a custom battery system. The company says that this should lead to small drone performance in a large form factor speeder. Quote, we want people to look at the curves of the MKI and instantly know that it is a flying race car, invoking a passion for a sport unlike any other. To achieve this, we have taken the body from an old 1960s Formula 5 car and retrofitted it to our low-cost test frame, hinting to a golden age of motorsport being reborn into a modern world. And their ultimate goal is to hold the world's first flying car race in the Australian desert in 2018. And I guess my only thought is that this sounds like it's being marketed a little bit the way we talked about the Icon A5 being marketed, so I hope people realize what they're getting into when they climb into one of these racers. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to talk about night flying and some of those important things that your CFI might not have taught you. Plus, listener questions, including a listener who asked about using a circular landing pattern rather than the standard rectangular traffic pattern that we all fly. Stick around. We'll be back with answers to those questions and more right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Welcome back. Before we talk about night flying, let me give you a few quick updates. I spent the entire day yesterday with a gentleman who took his check ride at an airport, perhaps 20, 30 miles away from my home field. I wanted to meet the examiner, so I went along with him. And there was kind of an interesting aspect. Oh, he passed, by the way. It was a private check ride. But there was an interesting aspect that came out of that. Apparently, there was an accident in which an aircraft which had a examiner, a designated pilot examiner, DPE, on board a couple of weeks ago out in the Central Valley of California. And apparently the FAA is investigating whether or not there was a problem with a fuel servo as part of that accident. So this examiner was quite interested in the compliance with that particular AD in our aircraft and spent a really long time looking at it. So the AD number was 2001-06-17. The description is detect over-rich fuel mixture, and the method of compliance is listed as adjusted fuel servo and installed POH labels. So there are labels that have to be inserted into the pilot operating handbook. Well, it turns out there are two labels, and there was just one in our POH. So the second label was not there. So I went ahead and got it typed up and taped into the manual. So I was kind of helping comply with the AD on the spot so that we were all perfectly legal. So those are the kinds of things sometimes you have to do to make a check ride come off. But I'll certainly be paying more attention to that AD in the future, and you might want to as well. Also, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about our trip last week to Miami. I didn't mention too much about what we did for flight planning tools. And Carlos used the AOPA flight planner, which is powered by Jeppesen. Of course, you have to be a member to use that. And he was often using the weather along route feature. Now, that was something that we talked about a few episodes back when we talked about our flight planning listener survey. One of the listeners said that he likes the weather along route feature, which applies a quarter to the route. So I can't remember plus and minus how many miles, but it looks left and right of your route along the entire way. It looks at what weather is within that corridor, and it calculates crossing time, so it estimates what the weather forecast will be at the time you cross a particular airport. I also was using the ForeFlight GPS MOS charts that one of our listeners talked about, and to find that, you just go into ForeFlight, look under Imagery, and then Browse, and it's a series of prognostic charts that go out about 84 hours, which is about 3.5 days, and they're in 3-hour intervals, which gives you a pretty fine resolution of what they expect the future is going to look like. One set of charts shows the forecast ceilings for the entire country, and another shows forecast visibility for the entire country. And they've got shades of color, which indicate different levels of ceilings and different amounts of visibility in miles. And if you haven't already, I'd like to invite you to take our listener survey. This month, we're surveying aviation headsets. If you use an aviation headset, and I certainly hope you do, go out to the survey, tell us which one you're using, how you rate it, any issues that you've encountered, or if you're thinking of buying one, tell us which one you're thinking about. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, and in a future episode, we'll give you a summary of what people think about their headsets. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're thinking of buying a headset, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on headsets in the upper left corner, and you can see the ones that I use and the ones that people have actually started to recommend in that survey. Now, I wanted to mention that I do a lot of photography when I'm flying around, and I just posted one of those pictures here on the Patreon page. On the way back from the check ride, it was nighttime, and as we came across the San Francisco Bay, the lights of the city were quite spectacular, and they were also reflecting off the bottom of the aircraft wing, so we had kind of a mirror image of the lights off the wing and the lights below us over the city. So go ahead and go out to our Patreon page, aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can see that photograph. Speaking of Patreon, I'd like to thank our two new supporters this week. They include Kenyon Nawatney and Carl Rossi. And I want to thank them both for joining a group of 75 Patreons, people who donate each month via credit card to help support the show. And I would just love to see us get from 75 to 80 Patreons before the end of the month. So if you're thinking you'd like to be a special part of this group of listeners, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, type that into the web browser, and then you can look at all the posts that I have up there that anybody can see. For example, the photograph I was just talking about. And if you really want to, you can also make a contribution toward the show as little as $2 a month, and that'll be billed to you your credit card. At a different contribution levels, you can get different goodies. You probably know by now that at $4 a month, you can see the full script for the show, and at $8 a month, you get not only the show notes, but the list of all the stories we had to cut this week. I cut 7 stories that we didn't have time for. And at the $20 a month contribution, you can see the full script for our Newsmaker episodes, where we interview people who are in the news. All that's out there at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now stick around, because in 7 seconds, we'll return with what your CFI didn't teach you about night flying. And welcome back. Hey, for about 10 years in a row, I gave a regular presentation at Oshkosh every year at AirVenture on night flying. And so literally a couple thousand people over that 10 years have listened to me talk about night. And I'm going to talk a little bit from that presentation. So I want to first start off by saying that I think that when we're kids, when we're young, we have certain fears about night. You got monsters in the closet or under the bed and so on. And what I tell people is, as adults, we tend to get that socialized out of us. But in some ways, the kids are right, because there are things that happen at night that are more dangerous, especially when you're flying. Now, a lot of people joke about flying at night is no different than daytime because the airplane doesn't know it's dark. Well, that's a cute, funny joke, but it's a pretty dangerous myth. That could be true in well-lit areas where you have absolutely no weather. But the issue is that the human factor is what really makes flying at night different. People really are the weak link in the process. So yeah, for the airplane, it's not much different flying at night. But as humans, our senses are imperfect, and the night really accentuates our shortcomings. So a couple of key takeaways I hope you'll get from this is that dark night, those are nights where there is no moon or where the moon is obscured by the clouds, is really the most dangerous situation for night flying. And there are also some unique takeoff and landing accidents that occur, as well as the danger we have with CFIT, the controlled flight into terrain. That's much worse at night as well, too. Another important thing to realize is that our senses lie to us. And I'll tell you a couple ways that we get misled by them. And unfortunately, knowing that they lie to us really isn't sufficient to prevent us from getting in trouble. So we'll talk about ways to overcome the shortcomings that we run into at night. Of course, being instrument proficient definitely helps at night. And anytime you fly at night, you really want to be willing to make a 180 if things are not working out. And you probably also want to do a little extra careful planning while you're flying. By the way, I would always survey the audience, and I always ask them to raise their hand if more than 10% of their flying hours were at night, and just a few hands would go up. And then I would ask how many people flew more than 5% of their hours at night, and more hands would go up. But it was never more than about a quarter of the audience. So what I conclude from that is the vast majority of flying is done in the daytime. Less than 5% of general aviation hours are flown at night. And I'll tell you why that's important in a minute. I'd then talk about why we fly at night. First, it's beautiful. I've been up at night a couple of times this week already, and it's really quite beautiful. You get better airplane performance, which is nice. There is less turbulence and fewer thunderstorms. And it's also a lot easier to spot traffic at night, though sometimes it's occasionally harder to avoid traffic at night. There have been situations where airplanes that have seen each other at night have tried to avoid each other, but they've been so confused that they've actually hit each other. And I've certainly been confused when I'm up there trying to figure out, do I climb, go to the left, to the right? How do I avoid that bright light that I see? So it's not always easy to avoid the traffic at night. Now, there are some things that are much more difficult at night. For example, it's a lot harder to see, obviously, and that affects you during the pre-flight. It affects you when you're trying to find switches in the cockpit. Taxiing, if you're at a strange airport, it's more difficult. Reading maps are a lot tougher, though if you've got an iPad or a moving map, that is a little bit easier, and that helps. Spotting terrain can be impossible in some conditions at night, so that can really get you in trouble. And of course, landings are also more difficult at night as well. And by the way, I would just say that in many general aviation aircraft that I've flown, particularly the older ones, the cockpit lighting is abysmal, and it's just very hard to read the instruments. So the newer aircraft do a little bit better job with cockpit lighting. So what else is more difficult at night? Well, navigating is. You certainly can't see checkpoints on the ground, though a lot of navigation these days is done by GPS, so that solves that problem. used to be it was really hard to find fuel at night, but now with self-service fuel, it's a lot easier to find fuel at night, but certainly hard to find any other services at night. Now, your circadian rhythms are really working against you. It's easy to get fatigued, and if you're flying late at night, well, that puts you at greater risk of an accident. My personal minimum, by the way, is I no longer fly after 11 p.m. at night because I know I'm tired, and it's just silly to be out there flying when you're tired. There have been a remarkable number of accidents that occur at midnight, 1, 2 a.m. in the morning, and it's just a crazy time, I think, to be flying. Spatial disorientation, much more likely to happen at night. That occurs when you cannot see the horizon. So the sky kind of blends with the ground, and if you're a private pilot not trained on instruments, it's pretty easy to get the airplane into an unusual attitude. Now, VFR into IMC is about 10 times more likely to occur at night, and that's not surprising because it's a lot harder to see the clouds and to avoid them at night. Now, emergencies are also harder to manage, and for example, the loss of an alternator is a lot more serious at night, because if you lose your alternator and then your battery dies, well, guess what? You're going to have a very dark cockpit. You might not have a landing light to land. You might not be able to put the flaps down. All of that is just much more difficult at night. Of course, if you have an engine failure, it's going to be tough to find a spot to land as well. The other course challenges at night are that the accident record is abysmal and that our senses, as I mentioned before, can lie to us. So let's talk about why the record is abysmal. If personal night flying is less than about 5% of all flying, it probably should surprise you that fully 21% of all fatal accidents in the United States happen at night. So did you get that? Less than 5% of the flying is at night, but 21% of all fatal accidents are at night. And it's even higher than that in some of the regions. So what that tells you is the chances of having a fatal accident are about 4 times higher when you fly at night. So if you can avoid flying at night and flying in the daytime, guess what? You just greatly reduced your risk. By the way, even car accidents are more likely to be fatal at night. The National Safety Council has said that at night, there's a 4 times higher fatality rate in cars. Now, I mentioned the accident rate varies a little bit by region. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we frequently have low clouds, and they mix up with the terrain that we have around here, which makes it very, very difficult to get through the mountain passes. And I did an analysis for a 10-year period, and I looked at all the accidents that occurred at night. During that 10-year period, 44% of all fatal accidents occurred at night here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So just be aware, some parts of the country, night accidents are even worse. Now, according to the Knoll report, it turns out that if you have an accident at night, you're twice as likely for that accident to be fatal. So here are the numbers. If you look at all the accidents that occur in the daytime, about 15% of them are fatal. So if you have an accident in the daytime, 15% chance somebody's going to die in the cockpit. At night, if you have an accident, there's a 30% chance that someone is going to be dead in the cockpit. So just be aware when you fly at night, if you have an accident, the odds that somebody will get killed go up by a factor of 2. Also at night, 66% of IFR accidents are at night. So if you're flying IFR, it gets a lot more dangerous. Non-precision approaches have a 5-time more likely chance of having an accident than precision approaches. And if you do fly IFR at night, do not circle if at all possible. I have tried to find statistics and haven't found any, but in general, people believe that circling at night, especially if there's any weather, is incredibly dangerous. These days, there are instrument approaches to almost every runway end from every direction, so there's almost never a need to circle anymore, so avoid it, even if you have to land with a slight tailwind. That, to me, is preferable to circling, especially at night. Now, according to the NTSB, dark night is particularly deadly. What do I mean by that? Dark night is any time there's a new moon, which means no moon, or an overcast. Now, think about when you go outside, how often do you see moon and see some moonlight? I would guess at least 50% of the time when you're out there at night, there's some moonlight available, unless you live in a very cloudy part of the country. Well, from a period of time here back in 2000, there were 146 fatal accidents during dark night and only 8 fatal accidents during bright night. So what that means is if there's a moon out, there's almost never a night accident. If it's dark night, well, that's when all the accidents happen, or in this case, probably about 98% of the accidents. So if you're going to fly at night, you might want to consider only flying when there's some kind of moonlight out there, and just be aware that in dark night conditions, that's when most of the fatal accidents occur. Let's talk briefly about VFR into IMC accidents. That's basically when you fly into a cloud and you're not on an instrument clearance and you have an accident. About 90% of those accidents are fatal. So as a private pilot, do not go into a cloud under any circumstances. If you do, and you have an accident, 90% of the time, someone in the cockpit is going to be dead. So you want to avoid VFR into IMC accidents. Well, it turns out when you analyze the data, about 50% of all VFR into IMC accidents that occur at night. And yet only about maybe 5% of the flying is done at night. So that tells you you're 10 times more likely to go into a cloud and have an accident at night. So that's just another risk factor. Now, safe night flying, I think, is possible, but it does require a lot more careful planning. It certainly requires a willingness to do a 180 if things are not working out well. And you really need to understand some of the illusions that are out there. So we'll talk about those in a moment. So some of the things that I think flight instructors are doing well in teaching night flying is they certainly teach the rules and the regulations. They talk about the equipment required in aircraft. They talk a lot about the structure of the eye, the rods and the cones, and how you have to let your eyes adapt to the darkness. And just to review some of that real quickly, remember that being legal versus being safe is not the same, just as being current does not equal proficiency. So here in the U.S., to get your private pilot's license, you need 3 hours of night flying. Plus you have to do a night cross country and have 10 landings at night. In Canada, they have a separate night rating, as do other countries around the world, and you have to have 10 hours of time at night to get that night rating, and that includes, by the way, 5 hours of night solo. We don't get that kind of training here in the United States until people go for their commercial certificate. That requires an additional long cross-country flight at night. Also requires 5 hours of night solo. So as a private pilot, you're far less trained here in the U.S. to handle night than pilots are in other countries. Let's just review some of the definitions of night. At sunset, you need to turn on your position lights on the aircraft. At civil twilight, you can start logging nighttime. Now, civil twilight is anywhere between about 20 minutes and 40 minutes after sunset. Kind of varies depending on the time of the year and what latitude you're at. The technical definition of it is that when the disk of the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon, that's civil twilight. And the third definition for night is 1 hour after sunset, we can start logging landings for currency purposes. And of course, if you're going to carry passengers at night, you need to make 3 takeoff and landings to a full stop within the prior 90 days. You need to have 45 minutes of fuel reserve at night. And the required equipment in your aircraft has to include nav lights, which are the position lights, spare fuses, and a source of electrical power. By the way, a flashlight is not required. I always tell people, however, to bring every flashlight they own. Bring lots of flashlights. A big one for pre-flight, smaller ones to use in the cockpit, and it helps if you can dim them a bit. So in terms of teaching night flying, I think that CFIs need to put more emphasis on highlighting the higher accident rate that occurs at night. I don't think people know that. Teaching night illusions, scenario trainings, and really teaching personal minimums. Let's talk about one of the first of those illusions, which is called cinematographic illusion. It used to be this was only taught to instrument pilots, but I'm proud to say as of 2012, it was added to the PTS for the private check ride after I sent an email to Oklahoma City to the FAA, and the wording in the PTS was identical to my email, so I'm pretty proud of that. But cinematographic illusion occurs when you take off at night over a dark area. It's not a problem if there's a well-lit area at the takeoff end of the runway, houses and stuff like that. But if you're taking off over water where the water is black, or you're taking off over forest or farm fields where it's black, you can really get in trouble and have an accident because of cinematographic illusion. And here's why it happens. When the aircraft accelerates, the fluid in the pilot's semicircular canals in their ears starts to move, and the sensation for the pilot is one of leaning his head or her head backwards, which they interpret as a climb. Now, what compounds this error is not only do you feel like you're leaning back and therefore climbing, but the typical attitude instrument in a round gauge airplane, the little mechanical gyro, it has certain errors built into it. They're just artifacts of the design. They're not meant to be there. But one of those artifacts of the design of an attitude indicator is when you accelerate that instrument, it shows a slight pitch up, even when there is no pitch up. So imagine this. It's dark at night. You're flying over a dark ground below. Your head starts to feel like it's leaning back. You feel like you're climbing. You look at your attitude indicator, and it indicates that you have a climb. So you can see this is a huge problem. It's not a problem in the daytime when you're flying in VMC conditions, because you look down, you see the houses, they look like they're not getting smaller, and you pull back. But at night, this false climb illusion leads pilots to either fly level or descend into the terrain. And unfortunately, most of these accidents occur within 1 mile of the airport after takeoff. So to be safe at night, you should always, during the climb out, immediately check that you're flying at VY, your best rate of climb, and look at the vertical speed indicator to assure that you've got a positive rate of climb. If you do that, you're not going to have somatogravic illusion, but it's important to look at those instruments. If you don't, you could crash and not even know why you got killed. So somatogravic illusion is a problem on takeoff. There's a similar illusion, but for totally different reasons, that occurs when you are approaching the airport, coming into land straight in, and when you're flying over dark terrain. That's known as a black hole approach, and please don't skip ahead. There is so much about this that pilots don't know. Most people think they know what it is. I assure you, you're probably going to learn something about this. So a black hole approach is when you're approaching an airport over a featureless terrain with few ground lights. Again, it's not a problem when you're flying over a well-lit ground, but suppose you're going into the Half Moon Bay Airport where you're flying over the water before you reach the airport. That's going to be a black hole approach. Now, stick with me on this. Imagine that you're out there a mile or two. You're on a normal 3-degree approach to the airport. Imagine you're looking out at the runway, and you're looking at the far end of the runway, and you're looking at the close end of the runway. Now, that runway forms an angle in your eye, so it's going to fill up, a certain portion of your eye. As you fly a normal 3-degree glide slope and you get closer and closer and closer to the runway, that angle is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the runway fills a larger and larger portion of your eye. That's what a normal approach looks like. But something really bizarre happens when pilots fly at night on what should be a normal 3-degree approach. Instead of flying an approach that allows that angle to get bigger so that the runway fills a larger portion of their eye, they fly an approach path which causes that angle in their eye to remain the same. And there's only one approach which causes that to be the case, and that's when pilots fly a path that is a curved path that goes below the glide slope and unfortunately comes up just short of the runway. Now, this leads to an abnormally low approach and often crashes before they reach the runway. Now, Boeing did a simulator study in which they took airline pilots and they put them in the simulator and they simulated the black hole approach. And what they found was every single pilot crashed when there were no cues coming up from the ground, no lights from the houses that were flying over a dark area. They then explained to them what was happening. They put them back in the simulator, and guess what? Almost all of them crashed again. So what that tells you is that even knowing about this illusion, this black hole illusion I've just described, is not sufficient to keep you safe when you fly over dark terrain approaching a runway at night. Therefore, here's what I recommend. At night, always fly a normal traffic pattern. Stay in relatively close to the field, fly kind of the same downwind base that you normally fly. Don't fly a final segment more than about 2 miles. So in other words, don't make an unusually long downwind. Just make a normal downwind. Make sure you're coming onto final maybe 1.5 miles away from the runway at the most. And don't do a long straight-in approach without either a VASI, which gives you visual guidance to the runway, or with some type of electronic glide slope, either an ILS or a GPS approach. And for those of you who are private pilots, you don't have to be an instrument pilot to dial up the ILS or loaded GPS approach to provide electronic guidance when you're coming in at night. Work with an instructor, figure out how to at least get that dialed in. Now, don't cheat and go flying in the clouds because that's really dangerous and may kill you. But learn how to dial it in so that you can use it as additional guidance when you're coming in on the runway at night. Now, another thing I suggest is know how high you should be for every mile that you are out from the runway. So, for example, a normal 3-degree glide slope, you're going to drop 320 feet per nautical mile. So if you have your GPS up, you turn 1.5 miles final, you should be about 1.5 times about 320, or roughly 500 feet up as you turn on to the final. Now, my airport has a 4 4-degree glide slope, a little unusual. So at a mile and a half, I should probably be closer to 600 feet when I turn on to the final. If you use little benchmarks like that, you can check your altitude all the way around the traffic pattern to make sure that you're not getting too low as you're flying into the pattern at night. Now let's talk about some planning considerations. When you're planning your route, don't just fly the GPS direct route to your destination at night. Plan your route so that you're flying over airports or even highways if possible. I find it incredibly comfortable at night to see all those rotating beacons at the airports I have flight planned over. That way I'm always within glide distance of an airport, and that's going to greatly enhance your safety if you were to lose an engine at night. Also know what the safe altitudes are. So for example, on a sectional chart, look for the MEF, the minimum elevation figure, which is that big number in each of the squares on the chart. Or if you've got an instrument low altitude and route chart, look for the OROCA, the off-route obstacle clearance altitude, which is similar. Go ahead and use your PAVE checklist. That's a personal minimums checklist that is provided by the FAA, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes so you can find the PAVE checklist if you're not familiar with it. As I mentioned before, my personal minimum is that I don't fly after 11 o'clock at night, but you might also consider personal minimums such as never flying unless you have at least a quarter of moon, which was something that an old flight instructor told me when I first became a CFI. Obviously, you don't want to fly when you're tired, so if you need to, stop. At flashlights, there are lots of great LED-type solution flashlights, so go ahead and pick something that's going to work well for you. So some of your pre-flight considerations, if you can, do your pre-flighting of the aircraft in the daytime if possible when there's lots of good light. Make sure that all of the lights on the aircraft are working, especially the cockpit lighting. A lot of people don't realize that cockpit lighting in some of these old 1970s Cessnas, just one little red light up on the ceiling. In fact, on some of those aircraft, I'm so tall my head would block the light and I couldn't see the instruments. They weren't lit up. Also, you want to brief your passengers at night. A friend of mine who is a very proficient CFI took a friend of his flying at night, and as he was on the downwind, just as he was about getting ready to land, the passenger next to him said, "Smile." He took his picture. Can you imagine flash photography? Really lucky that they were able to land safely. I've heard of other stories where a flash has caused an accident. So brief your passengers ahead of time if they bring a camera. No flash photography after it starts to get dark. After you start your engine or during taxi, you want to be really careful, especially if you're taxiing at a poorly lit airport. You don't want to run into anything. Also, worse than that would be having a passenger walk into a spinning prop. We had an accident down in the Fresno area in which a charter pilot was waiting at the airport in the airplane. His passengers called him and said, "Hey, start the engine. We'll be there in 5 minutes." The passenger walked toward the airplane and walked straight into the prop. It is really hard to see a spinning prop in the daytime. It's almost impossible to see one at night. So here's my rule. Anybody gets in and out of the airplane, stop the engine. In my case, if I'm going to leave the engine running, it's only because I'm climbing out to let a solo student make their first solo. And when I do that, I'm going to position the plane so that my instinct will be to walk toward the back of the plane. In other words, if there's a place where I'm going to be standing to observe them, I make sure we position the airplane before I climb out so that the only way I will walk toward that place where I want to stand is by walking toward the rear of the aircraft. So remember, the odds of something like that happening, walking into a spinning prop, really low, but the consequence is really high. So I think these low probability, high consequent accidents are things that you really need to give a lot of time and attention to as a pilot, because it's easy to think, oh, that'll never happen. But if it does, it's pretty awful. Now, during the takeoff and climb, we talked about semagravic illusion, so beware of that if you're flying over water or unlit terrain. Make sure that you're climbing at VY, your best rate of climb, and that you have a positive rate of climb. Up in cruise, well, that's generally the safest phase of flight for any flight, whether it's in the daytime or the nighttime. But be aware of any false horizon illusions. If you've got sloping cloud formations or light patterns on the ground, it's possible to get into an unusual attitude. I remember one time flying out in the Central Valley of California where it was a little hazy and the sky perfectly blended with the ground. I could not distinguish the difference between lights on the ground and stars in the sky. So you may, in the dark, as a private pilot, find that you are unable to see the horizon. And that's going to be the same as flying on instruments. But frankly, with just the 3 hours of training that you get under the hood as a private pilot, you are not qualified to fly in dark conditions where you can't see the horizon. So make sure you use the autopilot. Better yet, don't go flying when it's dark. dark. I think, by the way, it's really unfortunate that, pilots get only 3 hours of hood training, and some of them believe that, that's sufficient to help them out if they fly in a cloud or if they're flying in pitch black, when it's not. Not only that, often that training has happened years before they encounter a situation like that. Now, terrain awareness tools help a lot. So, for example, I'm almost always in a glass cockpit with a Garmin G1000 or a Cirrus Perspective, and we've got tools where we can turn on terrain mapping, and we can see exactly whether or not we're safe above the ground or whether the ground ahead of us is actually above us. You can also find those kinds of features in some of the iPad-type applications or some of the old portable GPSs. So use that at night to avoid accidentally flying into terrain that you can't see. Now, during the approach phase for landing, that's when most night VFR accidents occur, when people are descending to get down to the traffic pattern. So here's a tip. Anytime you're approaching a ridge, and we have lots of these mountain ridges around here, as you're approaching the ridge, look at the lights on the other side of the ridge before you get to the ridge. And as you approach the ridge, you should see more and more lights appear on the far side of that ridge. If you see fewer and fewer lights on the other side of the ridge, that means you are below the height of the ridge and you're going to crash into it. Black hole approaches we talked about for landing. Avoid the long straight-in approaches. Use a VASI or an ILS where possible. Try and stay in close to the runway, no more than 1 to 2 miles maximum on final. And use altitude references such as the 320 feet per nautical mile to determine what altitude you should be as you turn on to final. Now, when you're landing, you want to line yourself with the row of runway lights, but not the approach lights. Some airports have these instrument approach lights that resemble a runway. Don't descend into those. Make sure you're actually looking at the runway lights, which are past the approach lights. Now, to figure out when to start to flare, look at the end of the runway as you're descending. And then as those lights at the end of the runway start to move up, that's when you want to go ahead and start to pull back so that you can go into your flare. Now, be careful when you're referencing those runway lights because they stick up 1 or 2 feet above the ground. Invariably, that causes pilots to flare high. So if you're using the runway reference front lights, which you should be, just be aware that you're probably going to end up flaring higher than you think you are. And as I mentioned earlier, emergencies are much more difficult to manage at night. So, for example, if you have an engine failure, it's going to be a lot harder to pick out a possible landing site. Now, one thing you'll read is that dark areas tend to more likely to be fields, and so you should head for the dark areas. That's not going to be universally true, but it's certainly one thing to consider doing. I would watch out landing on roads. Almost every road I've ever seen has power lines or telephone poles along the side of it, so you want to be real careful about that. And if you do have an alternator shut down, go ahead and reduce your electrical load as much as possible. Turn off all your unnecessary lights, unnecessary equipment. You want to preserve as much electrical power in your battery as you can because when you get to your destination, you might have to use your transmitter to activate the pilot-controlled lighting. And that's going to be a real problem if you arrive and you can't turn those lights on. There have been numerous cases where pilots have tried to land when the runway lights were off, and almost always it ends up in an accident, sometimes a fatal one. Now, here's what I do for dealing with emergencies. I tend to carry a backup radio and a portable GPS. Now, for backup radios, it really helps to have an external antenna. The Cessna T210 that I used to own years ago, we had a separate connector on the front panel, which allowed us to connect the handheld radio directly to an external antenna. And boy, that really made that radio a lot more effective. Because if you're using just that little rubber ducky antenna on the handheld radio and you're inside a metal airplane, that aircraft pretty effectively shields your transmissions, and it makes it hard for ATC to hear you when you transmit. But if you're able to connect it to an external antenna, they're going to hear you just as well as if you were on one of your other radios that are built into the airplane. Now, you might want to consider getting a cell phone interface to your headset. I have one with my Lightspeed headsets. It works great. I keep a complete list of phone numbers of NorCal Approach, local airport towers. On rare occasions, I've had electrical failures, and I've called the tower ahead of time, and I said, hey, look for me. I'll be inbound from the northeast in about 10 minutes. And that made it much easier to get a light signal for landing. Now, I put together a map showing all of the accidents for aircraft that were going to and from the San Francisco Bay Area over a 10-year period. And these accidents were all over the state of California. And this was just for night and weather accidents. And what was really startling about this was virtually every one of these accidents was in a mountainous area. So if you look at the Central Valley, which is very flat, 400 miles long, almost no accidents occurred there. But all of these other accidents occurred where there was some kind of terrain, some kind of hill. So just be aware that when you're flying at night or in weather, it's the hills that are most likely going to get you. Well, just a few other safety tips here to keep in mind. When you fly VFR at night, you might want to use IFR-like procedures for terrain avoidance. So go ahead and note the MEF figures on VFR charts or the OROCAs on IFR charts, or use those minimum route altitudes that are printed on IFR charts. And avoid spatial disorientation. If you don't have any kind of horizon at night, use your instruments, but try and avoid moonless nights if at all possible. Remember, most of those accidents occur on dark nights where there's no moon or where there's an overcast. You also want to choose routes that are going to maximize your safety. I mentioned flying along roads and over airports. Go ahead and fly common routes and passes in the daytime that you plan to fly at night to determine your personal night minimums for that route. So, for example, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I routinely fly through the Sunol Pass, and I've seen in the daytime how comfortable I am, what minimum altitude I find acceptable to go through that. And at night, obviously, I will never go below that. So if you figure that out in the daytime, it makes it a lot easier to know what altitude to be at when you're flying that mountain pass or route in the nighttime. Of course, you want to check weather and get updates en route if you can. Lots of ways to do that, either with things like XM weather or ADS-B weather, or call flight service. Now, at night, probably you ought to double your personal minimum. So if in the daytime your personal minimum is to, fly when the clouds are at least 2,000 feet high, well, at night you want to make sure they're at least 4,000 feet high. Or if your personal minimums are for visibility to be at least 6 miles when you fly, well, consider making sure they're at least 10 or 12 miles when you fly at night. Now, at night, I, in general, if at all possible, like to land at airports only at which I've landed before in the daytime. Because you go to a strange airport and it's relatively small, boy, you can really get in trouble going there at night. When I fly really long trips, like the one I talked about last week where I flew a Cirrus from California to Miami, when I'm making landings at night in an unfamiliar city, I always choose the largest airport in that city. Years ago, I was with a gentleman who'd picked up a Columbia 400 at the factory in Bend, Oregon, and we were flying it to New Jersey. And we made it all the way to Indianapolis that night. And I chose Indianapolis International Airport. And I'm sure he was thinking, why did I choose that big airport? It was going to be more expensive. Why didn't we pick some other smaller, less expensive airport? Guess what? They have about an 8,000-foot runway. And I swear he used most of it. And so when you've got an aircraft that you're not familiar with, it really pays to have nice, long, wide runways if you're going into a strange airport at night. And here are just a few other tips. Always take a look at the temperature dew point spread, because fog is a really terrible thing to discover by surprise. But if you look at the temperature dew point spread ahead of time, at least you'll be prepared for that possibility. Watch out for night-related NOTAMs. You want to look out for any runway or beacon lights that are going to be out, or perhaps any lighting that's out on any nearby towers or obstructions. You might want to bring your reading glasses along, because it's certainly much harder to see charts and everything else at night if you're up at the age where you start to need reading glasses. So it's going to be somewhere around age 40 to 50 that most people end up doing that. Now, if you're flying in an aircraft that you're not particularly familiar with, you really want to spend a lot of time in the daytime figuring out where all the switches are. It is just really tough to find switches inside an aircraft at night in the dark if you're not particularly familiar with the layout of that particular cockpit. Now, for flashlights, I would say always bring at least 2 minimum. I have one that I really love. I put a lanyard around it. I picked it up at a sports store, and that just goes around my neck. So if I need a flashlight instantly, I know exactly where it is because it's hanging right there. And so to wrap it up, let me just mention some of the key takeaways I talked about at the beginning. Remember that dark night, when there's no moon out there, is the most dangerous time. And that we've got some unique takeoff and landing accidents, such as cinematographic illusion and black hole effect. So our senses will lie to us, and so we need to come up with other techniques, such as using the VASI, using an ILS glide slope, or, for example, knowing how high we're supposed to be above the ground at every point in the traffic pattern. Make sure you stay instrument proficient, because you could encounter situations at night where you can't see the horizon and you'd have to be on instruments. And of course, always plan night flight more carefully and be willing to do a 180 if things are not working out the way you think they should. Coming up next, we've got lots of listener feedback and questions. One listener tells us about traffic that she saw and didn't see on her portable ADS-B receiver during one of her student cross-country flights. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Quick check of reviews. Well, there were none this week. If you want to go ahead and review us, go out to the Apple Podcast app and leave a review. Or better yet, if you've got an iPad or iPhone, go into the App Store and check out our dedicated Aviation News Talk app, which you'll find there, and leave a review for us there. We're going to start using that app a lot more in terms of being able to upload videos and push out notifications when things are going on. Let's look at the listener feedback. I always say we have some of the smartest listeners. This comes from Nikki in Florida, and she, by the way, has submitted some recordings in the past to the Airplane Geeks podcast that I also help co-host. She says, I want to say thank you for this podcast and for many great tips that have helped me learn to fly. I want to tell you about my first cross country and what happened. First off, I was flying a 172 with ADS-B, and I had ForeFlight with the Scout running. Of course, that's an ADS-B receiver, and that's one of the receivers we have reviewed on our website. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on ADS-B receivers in the upper left. Anyway, Nikki says, a short time later during the flight, I was looking for my last checkpoint. I caught sight of an aircraft at 11 o'clock high, about 200 feet in front of me heading from the east. This took me off guard because I did not see this plane the last time I checked, and it was not on our ADS-B. I told my instructor, and he said to keep an eye on him. We quickly realized he was passing us, and about a minute later, he decided to turn to the south. I performed a descent about 500 feet to stay below. My instructor said that they probably did not even know we were out there. Just goes to show you that you always need to keep a lookout from airplanes. Thanks for the great podcast. And I replied to Nikki that, yes, one of the points I made on the show is that ADS-B receivers don't show all the traffic because the FAA decided to only upload traffic information for aircraft that are equipped with ADS-B out. So, Nikki, when you saw that first plane, you were probably within 30 miles of an ADS-B out equipped aircraft, and that traffic from your receiver was uploaded for that particular aircraft. But when you saw the second plane, most likely there weren't any ADS-B out equipped airplanes in the area close to you, so information about that airplane that didn't show up wasn't being transmitted. So ADS-B receivers are very misleading as they appear to show all the traffic data, but they specifically exclude large amounts of traffic that could be sent if only the FAA would do it. And here's a note from Mike in Virginia. He says, I'm a loyal listener to your terrific podcast. I have been wanting to get my private certificate since I was 5 years old. I'm thrilled to report I started lessons in September and have 35 hours in my logbook. Your podcast is wonderful inspiration and an easy way to get a regular dose of important GA safety. Thank you for all that you do. Well, you're welcome, Mike. Now let's take some listener questions. This comes from Larry from New York City. Larry is a new Patreon supporter. We thank him. He says, Max, I just discovered the podcast. I'm catching up on past episodes. I really enjoy the show on traffic patterns. I wanted to get your opinion on regular traffic patterns, that is the rectangular kind that we're all taught to fly, versus circular traffic patterns. And he mentions that AOPA had an article about that. He said, I've heard different thoughts on it and would appreciate your insight. Personally, I fly a Beechcraft 2008 G36 Bonanza, and I find a circular pattern works better. I do like the fact that you can pick a point and keep a constant rate turn going and not lose sight of the airport and be in a consistent configuration. And he also mentions that he's been flying with my good friend Doug Stewart back in New York. Doug was the 2004 National CFI of the Year. So I wrote back to Larry and I said, my guess is that circular traffic pattern is going to work much better with a low-wing aircraft like the one he's flying than with a high-wing aircraft. Because if you got a high-wing aircraft, when that wing is down, it's going to continuously block your view of the airport, or at least a good portion of the time, depending, of course, on how steeply the aircraft is banked. But I would think that with a low-wing aircraft, it's really going to make it very easy to keep track of the airport and to more precisely roll out onto the final each time. But here's the downside of the circular traffic pattern. If you're at a really busy airport like my airport at Palo Alto, there have been times that I've been cleared number 6 to land. And when that happens, I think a rectangular pattern is going to work better, because when the pattern is full, aircraft are going to have to extend their downwind. And also they're going to have to do that if there are a number of straight-in arrivals, which we often have at our airport. So I think we've got a really full pattern, and also when you have a lot of straight-in arrivals, I think the rectangular pattern is probably going to work better than the circular pattern. But I can imagine at airports that aren't particularly busy, circular patterns are probably great. And with that, let me encourage you to listen to the bloopers at the end of the show. But in the meantime, please share this show with all your friends. Let them know that Aviation News Talk is a valuable resource. So the app you're listening to probably has something you can click on it to share this episode with a friend. And frankly, that's really the only way people are finding about the show, is when listeners like you share it with their friends. Don't forget, Cirrus has incentives going on to the end of the year. Contact me immediately if you're thinking of buying a new Cirrus, no matter where you are in the world. I'll help you understand what those are and how you can go ahead and probably probably save tens of thousands of dollars if you buy one. This year, I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Pilots have, according to Garmin, access to the most recent data as... All right. Also from General Aviation News comes a story of a fatal flight involving an air transport...